All right, and we're back. Welcome to the Green Room tonight with Karl Dahl. This is being pre-recorded on Thursday, going live on Saturday. Karl, how's it going?
Going great. Thanks for having me, guys.
Excellent. Well, Karl, I've recently read both of your books, and your most recent Substack post as well, and that's got me sort of in the gun autism mood. You're single-handedly responsible for several of my firearms purchases this year,
Goody.
and my woman is not very happy about some of them.
You're welcome.
But yeah, so tonight I'd like to talk about the guns of With the Crusaders. But before we get into that, let's talk a little bit about what you recently put up on your Substack the other day, the idea of the quote unquote modern liberator that's sort of hinted at towards the end of Faction, the original Faction. Um, so would you like to kind of give an overview of what that is, kind of in universe, and then maybe what some concepts for it would look like?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm I'm going to be putting together a Substack article on the topic because I'm writing I'm writing articles about the Guns of Faction that explain some of the like very simple modifications that they have, which is all real world stuff that can be done. But the concept of the modern liberator is something that is achievable now. And I envisioned it through the, through the, through the screen of the character Joe Shea, who's this, espionage oriented guy who's been around for a long time. And he knows a lot of the old ways of doing these things and what has been tried in the past. So the highest level thing is like, okay, what is the Liberator? The Liberator was a stamped sheet metal 45 caliber single shot pistol that was manufactured. Like 1 million of them were manufactured, and they were airdropped to like resistance units all over the world. The problem is that a pistol is loud, and a single shot pistol is only good, for what it was described as, is that you would find an isolated soldier and you would shoot him with this thing, and then you would take his weapons and equipment. Right? Sounds good, but the problem is, a 45 is not quiet. And you only have one shot. And so the idea is like, there was a program in the 1960s, and supposedly there's a book out there that was, I want to say it was a program. It might have been associated with Rand. It was some sort of a program that I read about online, and I haven't been able to find stuff about it. I look for it every once in a while, but there's this book called Guns in a Hurry, theoretically, and it was this internal document for some program that was done where they basically said, in the 60s, what is a insurgency or counterinsurgency weapon that we could make that's incredibly cheap, that's much better than these things. Like sometimes you'll see it on these types of things in like gun websites. Like there was a 4-shot shotgun that used 4 barrels, and it was like dirt cheap to make. And then there's like really improvised stuff. Well, all that stuff sucks. So the concept of the modern liberator is, what is a standard issue weapon that you could develop for a resistance organization, a theoretical resistance organization, probably in Europe, that would be the best bang for the buck in every way possible. And so the parameters are, it has to use 9x19 millimeter ammunition, which is the world standard full caliber ammunition. You want it to be reliable. You want to have a magazine capacity appropriate for a fighting weapon. So like a double stack 9mm, let's say 15 rounds is pretty much like the basic standard. It must be capable of accepting and reliably operating with suppressors of varying sizes, weights, and sophistication. So if you think about when Joe Shea was coming up with this idea, like in the 90s and into the, or excuse me, in the 80s, until the 80s and into the 90s, suppressors were much less sophisticated than they are now. A lot of advances were made, and I talk about this in that article, the Guns of Faction Part 1, Beretta Urban Plinker, that suppressors with like the Nielsen device, which is the that like spring and piston that provides the compensation to basically the shot discharge that allows like a conventional Browning recoil operating system to function with a suppressor that weighs more than just a handful of ounces attached to it. That operating system is finicky, and that Nielsen device was invented in like the mid 80s, and like it wasn't even a thing on the commercial market until well into the 90s. There might be some exceptions, let's not worry about that, but basically it didn't become common until later in the 90s. Before that, people had to make like elaborate modifications to these pistols, and the suppressors were huge. The baffle design advanced by leaps and bounds. Before that, people would, basically like the CIA issued a very small suppressor that used wipes. It used like 4 or 5 wipes, which is like a rubber or polyurethane in current times disc that is cut with like a cross on it. And the idea is you shoot the bullet through it, and it essentially seals up and traps the gases. This limits you with like projectile type to a certain degree, but it's very, very, very quiet. It also increases the back pressure on the weapon, which makes it operate a little better. It throws a lot more impetus into the slide. And so it was like the way that people did it. There were other more primitive ways that people did these things. But this is a very simple design, and it works really well. And so, Joe Shea, this is his thinking of like, this is a cheap, functional way to do it. But being a professional from that era, he doesn't trust this Browning tilting lock barrel system. And he favors the Walther locking block design, as we see in the German P38, the Beretta 1951, the Beretta 92. These, you can look at pictures from the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s and see like rather gargantuan cans on these guns, and they work fine with them. Like there's all these pictures in my article of there's a German P38 with just a gargantuan suppressor on it that ran perfectly fine, because this is a really robust mechanism for dealing with the weight of, thank you, sir, the weight of the suppressor, because at the time it was like the simple design. And so efficiency was driven by like volume and number of baffles and that means this big giant suppressor. Well, we have much more advanced technology now, and so they can be much smaller. But the idea is that you don't know what all the different um, resistance organizations are going to have access to. So you want the most robust operating system possible. That way, the cans are incredibly simple and inexpensive. You don't have to like recreate the Nielsen device and be manufacturing Nielsen devices, for your organization, because that's machine time, and it's a very distinct item that you're making. You can have very simple suppressors without them. So there's like no benefit other than just the availability of that weapon type. But if you're building a special purpose made weapon that's going to be manufactured specifically either to be distributed by these organizations or manufactured by these organizations, why not go with an operating system that negates the need for that? So basically, what we're talking about is, in faction, they essentially they're using Beretta 92s and Beretta Model 81s, or excuse me, 82s and 32 ACP, um, as these assassination weapons, but it's the 92 is your full capacity, full caliber. Yes, 9 millimeters, full caliber. Deal with it. Weapons, because you can actually get in a fight with these, right? It's appropriate as a defensive weapon, and like for an assassination. Um, the the problem with these, the limitations of the handgun, however, which is where the modern liberator comes in, is that, yes, you can learn to shoot at longer distance. That takes, some amount of skill and confidence. You have training limitations. Like, the idea is this is a resistance movement. Like, you're not necessarily going to have a ton of training, or it's not necessarily going to be super safe to do a ton of training. The suppressors help to be able to like shoot in more places than if you didn't have them. But the idea is that like taking longer shots is much easier and more repeatable, like if you have a simple stock. So it isn't that you're using a full stocked rifle. It's that, we see this with chassis pistol chassis that have like a folding brace, or if someone SBRs a weapon, like there's that PDW concept, like B&T has that USW um, concept that is pretty much spot on for this concept, except it uses a Browning operating system. So in the modern Liberator, it would be more like of a Beretta style thing, although all you really need is that operating mechanism. You can move in a different slide direction. Yes, thank you. The idea is that by having that very simple light stock as an option, or you have a modular weapon that has a version that's pistol only, and then you essentially can, like, let's say like with 3D printing now, have you guys seen the 3D printed like chassis type weapons? Like, there's some very slick stuff that people are doing with those. You could basically drop the fire controls into that kind of a system, so that some people have these and others have just it as a straight pistol, which is nice and compact, right? It's easier to carry. um, Whether you have a red dot or not, like, the idea would be that this is something that's much easier for you to engage at slightly higher ranges if you have to, like from an extraction perspective, not like as a primary assault weapon or anything like that, but it gives you options. It gives you the ability to make, fairly accurate shots out to like 150 yards, which is stretching it, I agree, but it does give you the option. Like, I was shooting pistols at 100 yards with a friend of mine recently, and we are shooting at a human silhouette that was about 6 inches wide and 18 inches high, and we were hitting it, braced from a rest, like pretty. It's not too hard. It's you just have to take your time and focus on your trigger pull. Well, with the stock, that's super easy. Like with a rifle, that's super easy. Um, with a 9mm with a stock, it's like ultra easy. Final concept, and this is, I think, less critical, but just an interesting idea. Because, and this gets into gun spurgery. If you're aware of like the Beretta M93R, which is a machine pistol, well, it had a 3-round burst, and it had a folding stock that could be attached. There's the HK VP70, which had this big plastic. Like the idea was that it was this mass issue weapon, like if the Russians invaded Germany, that they could pass out. And so you have a pistol, a 9mm pistol, and then you mount this stock, which is also like the holster slash storage box. But there's also a mechanism in it, because the slide interfaces with the stock, that allows you to switch between single shot and doing a 2-round burst. And it's like an incredibly high rate of fire. It's like 1,800 rounds per minute or 2,100 rounds per minute off the top of my head in the VP70. Yeah, there we go. 93R. That it gives the idea is that these rapid, like 2-shot hits that can only do 2-round bursts when you have the stock mounted, because we're not scholars. The idea is to have it increase your hit capabilities, by having a 2-round burst when the stock is extended, because of a mechanism where the slide interfaces, and the sear interfaces with a stock that's like more in line with the upper part of the mechanism. So that's the idea that Joe Shea has, and I think it's a really sound concept, and it's totally doable. And I'm just throwing this out there. So when I publish my article, I'll have examples of basically like 3D printed PDWs that use like a uh, Glock fire controls and mechanisms. But there's also people have done the Beretta 92 and the Taurus 92. Uh, there's STL files out there for the lower receivers. So I will be dabbling with this, for people who can do this. And the first round will probably be a brace mechanism. But the idea is that, you can have a really simple can that you can form one. Let's say if we're in America and we're doing everything legally, you can form one, a simple can that'll run great on an inexpensive parts set, and you can make decent hits at range with it because of the folding stock capability. And that 2-round burst is this theoretical thing that's out there for this resistance organization. So anyway, hooray.
Yeah, that's a really interesting concept. Um, I was talking with some guys the other day, um, sort of along the same lines with particularly with the like the BNT um, concept about
Yeah.
sort of like a slightly more built up rig specifically for church security rather than
Mm,
just a handgun, because it's sort of impractical to even have like a little short barreled I don't know 300 blackout or whatever, but something like that built up BNT semi-stocked pistol would be an
yeah.
interesting thing to look at.
Pull up the B&T USW, um, as an example, maybe, so people can visualize this. Because I think that's like the sweet spot, the non-chassis one, but the one that's fully integrated. If you can find that, that'd be awesome.
What was it? The BNT SW?
USW.
USW. Gotcha.
Yeah, it's like universal security weapon or something like that. Yeah, there we go. And so if you can click on maybe the top left picture, so that we can see it better, it's just a pistol that has a little extra chunk at the back end of it. Yeah, the A1 at the far right side. Um, the the idea here is that it's a it's just slightly larger than a conventional pistol, and it has that folding stock capability, and it has that fixed optic. Like if you know, ideally you would have a red dot, a quality optic. Thank you, sir. But this shows you what we're talking about. Like the same people can manufacture a just straight pistol version that uses, I mean, what? It's really probably like 70 to 80% of the parts are going to be the same when you get down to it. You would just have a version that would have this folding stock. And again, theoretically, if the stock is extended, you could have a switch that would enable you to do like a 2-round burst. Because if anyone, I mean, we've all seen those Glock switch videos. Like these little light pistols, like if they're on full auto, they have an incredibly high rate of fire. After the second round, they're just going into the sky, or like a child in a housing project. And we don't want that. The idea would be that if you do a 2-round burst, you have a better chance of hitting someone at range, like reasonable range, like 50 to 100 yards, hitting the target that you're shooting at without wasting ammo or, rounds sailing off into the distance.
All right. Well, that's brilliant. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to what you have to write about that. Let's let's take it back about 90 years or so, and let's get into with the Crusaders.
Okay.
So we'll go kind of in order that the book presents, talking about the main firearms. So where better to start than with the Fitz revolver concept? Old Joe Shea's first revolver, or first hero gun, I guess.
Yeah. So there was a fellow named John Fitzgerald who worked for Colt Firearms, who was I want to say he was New York State police, and he was a firearms instructor and had done. He was involved in like shooting competitions and everything like that. He wrote a great book called, I believe his book is just called Shooting, that explains a lot of these concepts. But he was a big fan of the Colt revolvers, because especially like the new service, which was the large frame, because it was major caliber, and the mechanism layout was different than a Smith and Wesson, where you could cut away the whole front end of the trigger guard, and then you would bob the barrel to 2 inches, reinstall a front sight, and then typically round the butt, and like cut a fair bit of material off and reshape the stocks on them. And then he would carry 2 of these in his like coat pockets. He was a big guy with big hands, and the idea of the cutaway trigger guard was that so there's this thing called weather, and in the 20s, like if you look at the vehicles of the time, you were still pretty exposed to the weather when you're in a car, right? So people would wear these giant jackets, and they would wear like mittens and big like earmuffs and all this stuff. And even walking around outside, you would be covered head to toe because of the weather. And central air was much less of a thing, so you would go into places and people would be wearing heavy coats and hats and all this stuff because it's still freezing. And so the idea behind this trigger guard cutaway, which everyone is like, "What? Sounds like the worst idea ever. That's a safety issue waiting to happen." Well, at the time, the trigger guards tended to be smaller. Like you had to like pull your finger back and slide it in. And guys who need to grab a gun and be shooting immediately, that trigger guard is in the way, especially if you're wearing gloves, especially if you have big hands. Your fingers might have issues getting in. Like in the modern era, like it's way less necessary, because we have different clothing technology. We have heated vehicles. We have central air in buildings, and so it's much less of an issue. but it was a very popular modification among all kinds of people. Charles Lindbergh had a Fitz revolver, you know, and then guys would modify guns themselves. It wouldn't just be ones that they got from Colt, you know, and from Fitz doing the modifications at the Colt custom shop. Although you'll see, it's really cool. You can see specimens that have their Colt, beautiful, thank you, that have their Colt paperwork that shows that it was sent out as a Fitz revolver. Those have a premium value on them. And yeah, that's a beautiful new service. So it's a full size 44 special or 4440 or 45 long Colt or 45 ACP. There were some other calibers too, but Joe Shea starts out by acquiring, because the idea is that his mother buys a boarding house in Port Townsend, Washington, after his father dies in working in the logging camps. And so they finally move into town away from the logging camps, and boarding houses are a very interesting thing. And they were huge, especially during, in the old days, like that's how things worked, is, apartment buildings were a thing, but in smaller towns and in nicer areas and stuff, like a boarding house would be really nice because you would pay for room and board, and then you would also pay to have a meal. Like typically they would do like 2 meals a day, and then there would be a premium for, people who would be there for lunch and stuff. So anyway, so living in this boarding house, they have people who live there for a couple months at a time. And at one point, a whole bunch of law enforcement guys are staying there because they're doing booze interdiction, because that was a huge part of the booze trafficking. That area there, it's up at the mouth of the Puget Sound and right across from Victoria, Canada. So during Prohibition, it was a major bootlegger area. And so he gets introduced to these guys who are living in the house, and he's not a retard, and he listens and occasionally asks good questions. And so one of them lets him shoot some of their cool hardware. And so what Joe Shea does is his mother lets him buy a Colt 38, a well-used Colt 38 that's about 20 years old from one of the boarders, and send it to a gunsmith in Texas that this former border patrolman recommended. And then he gets his own, what I call the bootleg Fitz, which he carries when he goes to Europe. And people will say, people might say that sounds a little far-fetched, but that's not true at all, because in gun magazines and stuff at the time, people were talking about this. And my granddad had like a Colt 1911 when he was like 15 that he bought, because his dad had died when he was 13, and he had to take care of the house, so he bought a Colt 1911 in the early 1930s. So it's like, this is not far-fetched stuff at all. So he does a 4440 version when he's in Spain, using a Spanish knockoff revolver in 4440, or that's done up for him as part of his cover by the guys in the UK, because there was a huge market for bootleg revolvers, copies of American and British and so on designs that were made in Spain and then shipped to North America. They were huge in Canada and the United States. Mexico bought a lot of Spanish revolvers. The UK was full of Spanish revolvers of varying quality. Some of them were very good copies. There's a beautiful copy of the Smith & Wesson triple lock that was made in Spain that is worth even more than a triple lock, because it's just as good and it's incredibly rare and weird. And so people will pay $2,200 for a Spanish knockoff of a revolver. They're super cool though. So, and they have weird markings and stuff.
Did they ever fix a Webley? I was just thinking about that.
I think I've seen one because the bulldogs were pretty short, and I've seen some short versions of the Webley. Here's the interesting thing. So the Colt New Service was sold in huge numbers to the British and the Canadians and the Commonwealth countries in 455 Eley, or maybe it's Ely, or I don't know how you pronounce it, but it's the cartridge that's used in the Webley revolver, and it's very easy to just do a slight tweak to where the rim sets so that it'll take a 45 Colt cartridge. So that was a really common conversion, because after, as you may recall from the book, like after the war, there was this surplus and that was sold in the commercial market. So you could buy a very nice gun that was manufactured for World War One, and then oftentimes didn't even actually get issued. They got, they were manufactured in 1918, and then, that's the last payment, and it gets dumped. But yeah, I'm pretty sure I've seen a Webley of some kind that was cut way down. But I don't know that you would. Well, let me think about it. So the Enfield 38 Smith and Wesson version, there was a double action only version with the bobbed hammer as well, and so it should be a pretty easy fitsing.
Yeah. Maybe be a little bit harder to kind of get leverage for that break action.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. That's a good point.
Yeah. All right, so we fast forward a little bit. We're in Europe. So Joe Shea is in Amsterdam, right? Not Amsterdam, Antwerp, if I'm
Yeah.
not mistaken. I get the two mixed up all the time. Um, he's sort of hanging out with the U.S. Marines in the area over the
Oh,
consulate.
I'm sorry, Brussels. Yeah.
Brussels.
Yep.
No. Back when Brussels was a real city and not fake and gay and EU.
Oof.
Um, the Marines they spend a decent amount of time target shooting. And this part of the book's a little fuzzy to me. It's been a little while, but if I'm not mistaken, it's sort of you're focusing on like done up 1911s with the Marines, sort of with the aftermarket target sites, if I'm remembering correctly.
That's more later on. I don't think I do a lot of detail about what he uses for target shooting when he's with the Marines, other than maybe like an FN 32 or something like that. I forget. But yeah, it's been a while.
Gotcha.
I can look it up here really quickly, but yeah, the that is almost just kind of a throwaway, just to show that he was still shooting. Because my point being, like, it is a easily shed skill, and there's it's very high attrition rate to to handgun shooting, but it also shows kind of his uh personality and interests, and that helps him. There's some attention that gets paid to him. He does do jujitsu with them, and he learns to convert his wrestling into jujitsu. The idea being there that China Marines were a thing. The Marine Corps had a good chunk of the Marine Corps had spent a lot of time in China, and there was so by the time of World War II, there was this very very substantial portion of the Marine Corps that was extremely familiar with Asia, and jujitsu and martial arts and things like that.
Right, and then towards the end of that section, there's the scene in the back room of the smoky bar where Joe is sort of enticed, via his gun autism, by the agency that he comes to work for. Um, I loved reading that scene because, I myself, if I was ever to be enticed by any agency for any reason, it would, having a big old bag of really cool guns that I can play with is certainly the way
Yeah,
to
I
do
know. Yeah, that was the idea. That was the idea. And a friend of mine, I got that idea from a guy that I grew up with. Well, he was like the older brother of a guy I grew up with who he joined the Marine Corps in like I want to say it was probably 83 or some 82 or 83. And then I want to say 86 or 87, he came home and basically said, "See you guys. I'm basically going off to be a spook." And he was enticed by basically a sack o' gats in the John Woo style, but all this like exotic gear, and some other gear. So I kind of did that, a version of that, at the time to just like tickle his tism, to see his interest in that area.
All right.
But
Yeah, and then so
that was talking about the base. So there's like the suppressed FN with a Maxim silencer, some communications equipment, and then there's the Royal MM31, which is the Mauser broom handle knockoff that they made a machine pistol before Mauser actually made a machine pistol, and it was for the Chinese market. And so just, again, part of this is for me to just spurg out, but by sprinkling it there we go, beautiful, in a light dusting across throughout the book, it just doesn't devolve into just grinding detail, like some authors do that. My first
doing the Jack car.
Yeah. It's funny. I've heard that, and it's like to the point where it can get boring. And it was funny because one of my proofreaders for Faction was a couple. So two proofreaders. They were a married couple, and the gal loved the book, but she was like, I just skipped past this whole section. And I was like, yeah, that was a bit much. So I dialed in the autism, and this way the autism is still there with some details, but it isn't enough to turn people off, which is very important when you're writing. You don't want people to roll their eyes too
Yeah.
much.
Yeah, it would be funny if you if you wrote something in the Jack Carr style of like essentially blatant product placement, but it's 90 years in the past and people are like, what are you talking about? Like the excruciating detail on every last article of clothing and weapon and what suppressor you're using with what, every grain of bullet and
Oh my
so on
God.
and so forth constantly.
That that's funny because like I'm interested in that, but I know most people aren't, and so it just kills it. And I mean, maybe he does it well, maybe his books are good. I know they sell well, they sell really well, and but I just can't really do that. I want it to strike a slightly different tone, even though it's very tempting. It's very tempting. I'll have to
Certainly.
read I'll have to read an excerpt of his stuff and just probably roll my eyes, because I read a lot of like Tom Clancy and stuff, but I just don't read fiction very often anymore. It's because I have to read. I mean, hell, I'm translating a 200-page Spanish memoir from the 1930s, so like I don't have time to read trash fiction.
Yeah. All right. So we keep chugging along. We spend sort of, the book sort of goes back and forth between various scenes, in Spain, and then cutting back to sort of the training portion. Um, but maybe we can kind of lump all the training segments in together and then talk about those before Spain. So, while focusing on the guns, maybe we can do sort of a overview of what that training is looking like or looked like for Joe Shea and kind of what it would develop into. I know in your bibliography you list quite a few books on the subject, such as Colonel Applegate's book, among others. Um, but what was that pipeline sort of like, and how did it develop?
Yeah, so you know, my approach is fictitious, but it's almost certainly what was taking place to some degree or another at the time, because British intelligence was in the. So let me step back. Um, in World War II, the OSS, the American OSS, and the British or slash Commonwealth Special Operations Executive, the SOE, were training in Canada, and then later in the United States, but particularly in the UK, out mostly in like these stately mansions, these fine old homes that were owned by various people, where they had large estates, where they were away from the cities, and they could bring in a bunch of students that were typically international in nature, and they were training them for uh, covert operations on the continent and elsewhere. And the the British were gearing up for World War II, and there was a lot of espionage, British espionage activity immediately after World War One, until the war started in Europe. And the basic concept is they would typically take people who were uh, upper, from the upper class, who had, who could either be, diplomats, or, businessmen, who would then be basically gathering intelligence through the cover of being a businessman, right? Which is totally normal, and the way things work. So they would be these established people that would then be trained in, certain intelligence gathering type concepts. And then the SOE brought in some gentlemen from the Shanghai Municipal Police, which was a British law enforcement organization in Shanghai, China, specifically Misters Sykes and Fairbairn, who developed the pistol shooting, empty hand, knife, improvised weapon, smash it, like all the like killing people stuff, uh, that they were training these guys in for, for this element. There was like explosives and other things later, and more conventional weapon training as well. But the training paradigm was from the SMP. Well, gentlemen who had been in the SMP were traveling around in America. Like there's correspondence between, um, John Fitzgerald and, Colonel Fairbairn, and Fairbairn had and would issue for undercover guys uh, Colt New Service revolvers, and others that were fixed, that they were fixing at the Shanghai Municipal Police Armory. And he talks about it in Shooting to Live and stuff like that, which is his kind of manual from the. I want to say it was pretty fully fleshed out by the late 20s. This training paradigm, and they were training in North America and in Canada and in the UK by then. So it's a very small jump to say, well, the Shanghai Municipal Police, which was, part of the British government, and there was an overseas intelligence element involved in them, like were training with this stuff and then trained in World War II this way. They were almost certainly conducting this training in England, in the mid 30s. Like it's almost 100% guaranteed that they were having this program at some level or another, because we do have documentation that shows that these guys were there doing work for the British government. And so part of that is the British are gearing up for war with Germany again, even though like Americans, on the ground and the Brits on the ground don't want anything to do with another war in Europe. The powers that be do. So I think the training is really interesting and robust and really basic, and it's great for what it is, which is just this lowest common denominator, like high percentile, 90-10 rule kind of approach to, you have a couple days to train someone to fight with a handgun, and so you're going to do it as basically as possible. So he gets run through these schools, and they're training in these shoot houses that are just freshly built. And the idea is that this would later be one of these SOE training facilities, but they were like literally just building it out. And so Joe Shea is like the only student there, cranking through this intensive program, and then he ends up in London, staying in a house that's like run by basically the SOE precursor, or MI5, MI6, God knows who, doing training, and there's other people there, and so he's doing espionage training in London, learning like running tails and language stuff, and some kind of finishing school for intelligence elements. He also learns like lock picking and how to break into houses from an old thief, because this is an old thing that guys do time and they want to go straight. And so what do? If you're really good at crime, you teach the government and private businesses, you're a security consultant, right? And so a security consultant is teaching like housebreaking and lock picking, and how would you climb in through a window on this house without like breaking tiles and giving yourself away and things like that. So he's learning this stuff, and then one of his guys, the SMP officer, Mr. White, who's like the weapons and empty hand guy and knife stuff, etc., is basically like, well, you're going into a situation that you need to have some military concepts. So he does what I present is something that an SMP guy who was a veteran of World War I would be aware of, which is like Japanese trench warfare techniques and night fighting techniques. There's this book called Night Movements that was a Japanese military manual that was translated by the U.S. military into English. And so it's a fusion of a bunch of these kind of real basic, like World War One, trench operations, and like you come into this position and you have to dig in. So like here's the process that you would follow to develop your trench. First it's a little dugout with a berm in front of you, and then you have you dig down until you have a place that you can lie prone, comfortably, and then you're a proper single man position, and then how do you extend it out and things like that. The idea just like training him into this so that he's aware of it, because not only is it useful as like a form of training to kind of just make sure that someone's like down with this and they're internalizing it, but also so that they can recognize like the professionalism of the army that they're looking at, because he's not a military man. Like he wouldn't have had this kind of knowledge without being trained like in the fashion that a military man would.
Right, right. Yeah, it's funny. The British government likes to put blanket like 100-year seals on all their documents, especially regarding
Oh
intelligence.
yeah.
So kind of based on that, I don't imagine we'll get access to whatever they were doing until maybe probably starting about 10 years from now, I'd say. Like when 2035 roughly, so like 1935, 100-year disclosure or whatever. So I guess we got that to look forward to in a decade. But I wonder, kind of along the same lines, if it would be possible to FOIA any of the like OSS stuff that we were doing, sort of copying off the British.
It's
I
pretty
wonder
well
what's out there in that
it's
regard.
pretty well documented already, actually, because I talk about it a little bit in the book, but like Bill Donovan was his intelligence organization was like British almost entirely, uh, and then at the beginning, and it's extremely well documented, like all their processes that they were doing in New York, as well as their connections up in Canada, which shows up later, which is why I was able to write about it. But yeah, there's a lot that's there that I'm sure is still kind of, um, not totally out in the open. But I feel like on the American side, it's pretty well cleared out because it almost doesn't matter. It's like past really mattering at this point, other than like the foreign operations stuff, which to your point is like the super interesting part.
Yeah, I mean, not to keep sort of trailing off this, tangent too far, but there's a lot of, um, I don't know. I mean, of course, this is conjecture. We don't know, but I think there's going to be a lot of interesting stuff revealed as far as British pre-war, I guess, espionage operations, if they decide to follow the 100-year release policy and
Yeah.
not just seal that stuff forever.
I made, for the record, I made
Anyways,
up the thing about the MG34, the guy being a prisoner exchange, investigating the MG34 development in Switzerland and Germany. Um, Point being that was secret because it was an illegal weapons development by the Germans when it started. Just to have fun with that whole Versailles Treaty thing.
right. All right. So, we'll fast forward a little bit, getting into Spain. We can kind of, I don't know, maybe gloss over the initial part in Spain. While Joseph is acting under his cover, and then maybe kind of get into the meat of the war. Kind of going back to the guns. There's a few scenes early on where we're seeing militia of both sides with sort of varying firearms. I think there's the scene with the one of the first scenes with the Carlists. They pop out with like Japanese Arasakas, if I'm not
Correct.
mistaken.
Yeah, which was a
Um,
real thing. Yeah, they
right, and
yeah
the Republican militia have these like all beat to crap 1893 Mausers that are rusting out.
yeah, which is true, which is a real thing. They had a huge problem with the the nationalist officers like pulling the bolts out of the rifles and stuff like that. And yeah, so a lot of the times the militias ended up with just like bottom barrel, poorly maintained stuff in these. Because here's the thing is, in Spain, the army was very large and bloated. There was like one officer for every 7 men. It was this like sinecure that wasn't very serious, on the mainland, but the real fighting military was in North Africa, and that's where you had like the Spanish Legion and the Army of Africa, and the guys doing the real fighting. They were tight, and they had like the best gear. They had the artillery. They had the more better heavy weapons and stuff, whereas most of the stuff in domestic garrisons was oftentimes pretty poorly stored and stuff like that, beyond stuff for initial use. So yeah.
Man, where have I heard that
Yeah,
before?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so I guess kind of going back to the nationalist side of things, you wrote or you wrote a thread on Twitter, the Carlist or nationalist sort of covert weapons acquisitions. They really sort of had a hodgepodge of everything, at the start.
Yeah.
Um, you can read, and you posted about this, where they were getting shipments in from Belgium, from other places, sort of I guess siphoning off part of the contracts that were going out, particularly to China,
Yeah.
to source some of the Astra broom handle ripoffs and others.
Yeah, it's a really interesting story, and I'm actually translating the full book that's from, that I just had excerpts from the work of some Spanish investigators. I got a copy of the book, and I'm going hopefully going to be able to get the rights to publish it in English, and hopefully in Spanish, because I'd like to just put it on Amazon, because it's really interesting. It's the guys who basically created the Carlist Recate secret militia army. But the details of how they got the weapons are really interesting, and what the deal was is they would find men who would have a business reason to go into these areas, and then using other connections, funnel the money to arms dealers, and then they would smuggle them in either across the border from France, or they would do that, something that happens a lot these days in you know sneaky Pete stuff, which is that people will change like shipping manifests around and stuff like that. So there is an example of that where they went up into basically to, like, it was probably Astra, it could have been Bestigui Arms, or Star, or someone like that. They were up in Ibar, and were, because again, that's an industrial heartland, and so they had this order for hardware, to be sold at a hardware store, home goods, and stuff for nails and screws, and hinges and things of that nature. And they do the old switcheroo on a batch of weapons that they had also bought, that was destined to go to, I think, Belgium, to be shipped overseas. And so they do the old switcheroo, where the hardware that's bound for Navarre, that manifest gets put onto the small arms. And yeah, so there's all kinds of really interesting stories like that, and they got what they could get. If they did get a lot of really nice modern, for the time, like light machine guns and stuff like that, ammunition, etc., and they would try to get it in 7mm Mauser, so that it would be compatible with their weapons. But if they couldn't get it, they would just buy it. Like those Arasakas, those were captured. So in the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, the the Russians captured these weapons, and then the Russians would issue them, because they had so much ammunition and weapons. They would issue them to, like, we would consider them colonial troops, but it would be like the Baltic soldiers and stuff, the Baltic conscripts and so on. So they would give them these weapons in World War One, and then they would be captured by whomever, and then so here are these massive stockpiles of surplus weapons that are available, and they're really cheap. And so the Carlists would bring those in, and so on. The Carlists were serious about creating an infantry fighting units, whereas like the anarchists and the communists and everything were worried about like street murderers. So they would have these 32 automatics and homemade grenades, or even if it was just like a tin can filled with dynamite or black powder with a wick that you're lighting. Whereas the Carlists wanted to have like real infantry weapons so that they could do real infantry maneuvers.
And I think you did a really good job at portraying that sort of dynamic playing out, towards the beginning of the war, where you have these two essentially militia elements going to battle, up in the mountains of Eastern Aragon, or Western Aragon, and we see um, the Republic, quote unquote Republicans, the communists, anarchists, just essentially sitting in their positions, unable to engage the Carlists while sort of taking effective fire from these, disciplined, um, somewhat trained and motivated men.
Yeah, somewhat trained. That is the key, especially as the war actually started. They had so many new people join that a lot of them, they were learning on the job too, just like the anarchists and communists. And so the level of discipline wasn't necessarily there, but they were way more disciplined than the Reds. And were they necessarily sharpshooters? Eh, you know, not really. There would be cases where there are guys who were really well trained and practiced because they were hunters or something, but they were much more competent than the Reds were.
Certainly. So, kind of, keep going through the scenes in Spain. There's of course the various scenes with the militia units going through the Aragon front, then back into Madrid. Couple really cool gunfight scenes interspersed throughout those. I particularly liked the way that you portray like the sudden like violence that pops up on several occasions, but particularly in those two scenes, just the escalation of a gunfight from 0 to 100 instead of I don't know, instead of like glamorizing or romanticizing the way that like some movies or other fiction can do. I thought especially the scene in the jail, or quote unquote jail in
The
Madrid, did a
Cheka,
really good job
yeah.
at portraying that.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I mean, my experience has been that when violence happens, it happens very quickly. Like, you can also see where someone's working themselves up for it, but usually it happens like out of nowhere. And the only way, like the dedication in faction is boys in an ambush always err on the side of violence. And so to do that, to be the first with the mostest, you have to hit them incredibly hard and incredibly fast. And so that's how he handles it. That's how I was taught, and I've seen it play out in like dumb street stuff.
Right. All right. Kind of going back to training, I guess. Um, there's the scene where Joseph joins the Spanish Legion officially. Goes off to boot camp. We get a bit of a training montage. What was, I guess, the official military training, particularly for the Legion, but I guess just in general as well, um, kind of back then, but also I guess during the war, did it change, become more or less strenuous, etc.?
So the Spanish nationalists, as I've talked about, when the war kicked off, if you weren't already in the army, the way that you would get in the fight would be to join these militias, left or right. If you wanted to join the army, once they caught up, you would still have to go to a training camp, and they had a slightly abbreviated training that I want to say it was reduced to about 8 weeks, and then you would do some training with your units. Except the Legion retained a much longer training period. So again, that's mostly just most people I know will say the first like month of boot camp is just that initial brainwashing period to kind of get you with the program. That you're a cog in a machine, and so the amount of time that they spend on like basic infantry tasks is fairly high in the Spanish army for the time. But there's also like marching and just learning that coordination and really following orders, and then basic infantry tasks. Whereas the Legion were trained to a much higher like light infantry standard. So it was shortened compared to before the war, but it wasn't wildly shortened, and they had long periods again because they had professional leadership where they would be training once they got assigned to their units and everything. Um, it wasn't like, I mean, to a certain degree, you could be going into combat right away, but there were a lot of times during the war where the fronts would freeze up for a couple months and they would be preparing for something else, and there was a lot of training and preparation there. So that's where a lot of the additional training would come. And so I talk about that a little bit, where he gets assigned, he's in intelligence, which makes sense given his background and the fact that he's a foreigner. And there was a very important need for intelligence. There's reams of documentation about the nationalist like analysis that they did with captured weapons and equipment, because what they were doing is proving the case that the Soviets and other countries were the ones that were flooding Spain with weapons, because they were using this in negotiations and conversations with the the what's the term, the non-intervention committees, and the British and all these other people, to make their case that, like, we're fighting off the Soviets, or like, you need to help shut down the French border because all these weapons and equipment are coming over. So there was a lot of analysis done at that level. You would trust a foreign officer a lot less. Like, we see this in Mine War of Trouble, where a lot of the time they're less enthusiastic about having a foreign officer leading in a super serious engagement. So what they would do is they would be given these tasks that um, where they were able to prove themselves and their value. And so what are you doing in intelligence on a front is you're working with scouts and things like that. And so a really good way to test the integrity of a foreign officer who's in intelligence is for them to go on like night raids and stuff. And if they survive, then you can pat them on the back and say, "Oh, he's a good guy," because I mean, a lot, people get really goofy about the way they think about the military. Like, you're you're uh, you're a tool, and your life is fungible, and you're disposable in many ways, and you use men to accomplish objectives. And especially in a war like this, they were very happy to use radicals and foreigners to grind them up, so that they wouldn't be an issue after the war. So that's what a lot of the stuff going on is related to. The other thing too that I'll point out is that so there were foreign volunteers in Spain who had joined militias, but they were required, as the army consolidated, they were required to go into the Spanish Legion, because only the Spanish Legion would allow foreign troops. Other military units did not. And so that took a little bit of time. That happened. That transition took place during 1937, like early mid 1937. Condor Legion is different. The Italians were different, but other than that, everyone had to plug into into the Legion.
Right. And we talk about the it, Joseph's role in intelligence, and sort of collecting intelligence on weapons, etc. Um, very early on, I guess, actually, if I'm not mistaken, it's in the intro chapter. After a raid, they're sort of doing collections on various weapons, and one of the most important weapons that they come across is a Czech VZ-26, right?
Yeah,
If I'm not mistaken. Yeah,
that's
yeah.
correct.
And that at the time was one of the best, light machine guns around. And so obviously they're like, okay, we're gonna use this, right? Um, so in their analysis, in the nationalist analysis, they're coming across all these boatloads of hodgepodges of weapons that the Soviets are dumping to the Republicans, that maybe the French and all these other entities are sort of sending in all this stuff. The nationalists are sort of looking at that and they're like, all right, well, what are we gonna keep? What are we gonna rip the bolt out of and throw
Yeah.
away like they do with a couple Mosins, etc. So what are they looking for and whatnot?
So the biggest thing would be the if the cartridge used in any given firearm was within their logistical chain. And so they had been getting a lot of gear from the Germans, a lot of support from the Germans. So they were using 7.92 Mauser, 8 millimeter Mauser. Or if the like I pointed out, like the militias would capture weapons and use them until they ran out of ammunition for them. Um, and so there would be some situations like that where you would see that. But the other one would be they would look for like a 7 millimeter Mauser weapon. So all the Spanish stuff they would just when they recaptured it, they would just incorporate it into their logistical chains. But they would also use different stuff. They would use like the Russian 7.62 by 54 weapons, like the Maxim machine guns, or the Degtyarev weapons on like the fighting vehicles. They didn't change the guns out on the tanks and the armored cars because they would capture ammunition with it, right? And so they would be able to reuse that stuff until they ran out of ammo for it, and then often retrofit them. But that was kind of how it worked, and it really kind of depended on the stage in the war, where like the militias would use anything that they captured. The army would typically they would capture the stuff, and their logistical people would sort through it, and filter it and then determine where it was going. And so there's all this really great photography of the analysis that they were doing on packing slips and analyzing the markings and stuff like that, because as you may recall, 75% of Spain's gold reserves, and a bunch of other gold that was like seized from churches and stuff and melted down. So God knows how many, irreplaceable pieces of art were melted down and then shipped. 75% went to the Soviet Union, and then 25% went to Paris and was used for arms purchases from arms dealers in Belgium, Czech Republic, France. You know, so so they had a bunch of like really old crap and some cutting edge stuff. So like the Soviets sent them some cutting edge stuff, but most of what they sent them was old crap.
This is a bit of an aside, but how close do you think France was to having a similar sort of flare up as Spain in 36? Wasn't there a lot of street fighting
Yes.
in the summer of
Yeah,
36?
35 and 36, there was a lot of street fighting. They had a socialist prime minister, Leon Blum. Yes. And he ended up in power through the same Popular Front model, where the left formed a coalition that was basically run by the communists. Blum was a little more. Blum knew that they would have gotten smoked if they pushed as hard as the Spanish did. That's my understanding. I haven't studied it enough to be like have a super intelligent position on it, but yes, that it was very rough. It was things were very tight, and I think that's in the UK. But things were very tight in France during that period. But
Yeah,
the
Google lied to me. I'm sorry.
No worries. Yeah. Google often lies, don't they? But the international brigades and all kinds of gear was flowing through France. So aircraft, tanks, all kinds of trucks, of course, going to the Republic. Small arms, fuel, all kinds of stuff was going through France. It was coming by boat also, especially early on, but it didn't take long for the nationalists and the Italians and Germans to kind of shut that down. Mostly shut that down. Very very interesting, but yeah, France was teetering, and so the British were very involved, and the United States were very involved in trying to get France to not go full bullshit. Yeah, there we go. Affrontez-moi, entrez, manifestante et fautez de l'ordre, les February. I can't do numbers in French.
Yeah. That'd be an interesting I guess alternate history, because that a second French Revolution would be catastrophic at that
Oh
point
my
in time.
goodness, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, so we keep going through the Spain scenes. There's a series of scenes that's masterfully done, sort of changing the pace of the book a bit, into like an action thriller. Um, I love that portion of the book, but throughout that they are, um, to try to not spoil too much. There's a little bit of undercover work done, and they end up equipping themselves with a lot of Republican issue weapons and equipment, and then throughout the various encounters, they're grabbing particularly these Soviet machine guns out of an armored car and whatnot. But when you were writing that portion, what were you thinking in equipping them with the Republican weapons that you gave them, for deniability's sake, for whatever the case may be?
Well, the key thing to keep in mind is that the formal Republican Army and the Nationalists used exactly the same equipment. So it'd be a Mauser in either 1893 or 1916, and 7 millimeter Mauser. They had a their light machine guns would either be fed by the what do they call it, the kind of tray or clip scenario that holds like 20 rounds, or the nationalists had just gotten the top fed magazine version of that same weapon, which they issued beginning in very early 1938. And then they have like FN, captured FN 92 1922 pistols, partly because they're cool, but also because they have suppressors on them. And they do take a bunch of like grenades that are those they're a Polish fragmentation grenade that's much closer to like the modern concept of a hand grenade, and that you pull the pin, the spoon, you let go of the spoon, the striker swings on like a mousetrap spring, hits the primer, you throw it. Those were new. They also had some of the German egg grenades, which have the more of like the chemical fuse, um, like the stick grenades have, and they just didn't have the Italian ones. And the idea was it needs to look like equipment that would be feasible for a Republican unit. The thing with that top fed Hotchkiss is that if you close up that Hotchkiss. There we go. M39. The idea is that they're a brand new one, which is like being tested basically at the time, which I know they were testing those grenades with some iterations of them before they became fully standardized as the M39 with that fuse. Little you can play a little fast and loose with some of these things sometimes, but because the idea is that the Condor Legion would be using them, and then anytime the Condor Legion had stuff, it would then be handed out to the cutting edge Spanish nationalists. He's carrying his Barumi in a box holster on his hip, and so on. So yeah, that it's all gear that is totally feasible for them to be having. And then they also take that Tigre, that El Tigre rifle in 4440 that they have a takedown version of, and that's just a sneaky Pete weapon that they had gotten through one of the benefactors, modified and shipped in by the British with a Maxim suppressor on it. And then McIntyre is still rocking the Winchester 1895, but it's been converted to 7mm Mauser by changing out the barrel to be that of a Mauser 1916, because the nationalists did do caliber conversions as well. It's really interesting. There's gun magazine and kind of like print newspaper ads from the 50s and 60s when Spain was unloading what was basically all of their obsolete captured weapons, and tons of stuff converted to 7mm Mauser. And so my concept there is that McIntyre is left-handed, and then there's that little scene where they're like, look, if your armory here is doing all these barrel swaps and everything, why not let a very competent left-handed shooter keep his lever action, which he can keep running and operating much better than a bolt action, and just convert that for logistical purposes. Again, a bit of movie magic, as we might say, but semi-feasible given the time and the fact that they were doing exactly that with all kinds of weapons. There were a lot of captured like Polish Mausers and German Mausers from the First World War that were converted to 7mm Mauser.
Yeah, tons and tons of really cool conversions. When I initially finished reading the book, in my gun autist
there we go
spurgery, I started to look into stuff like the El Tigre and some others, and so I never knew this beforehand, but apparently in many, if not most, of the Hollywood westerns, the quote unquote Winchester 92 that they're shooting is actually a Spanish El Tigre.
Yep.
And then likewise, every World War II movie, or almost every World War II movie that includes a 1911 that actually cycles properly is actually a Star Model B. Since 45 blanks just don't really work. And I guess if you ever see in a movie a 45 that refuses to cycle properly, I think in Kelly's Heroes, there's a few examples where it's like stovepiping every round.
Yep.
I mean, that's a real one, but if they're actually cycling, it's a Spanish Star. I thought that was really neat.
Yeah, that's very true. Like Pulp Fiction, Jules is using a Star in 9mm, even though he's talking about like Mr. 45 here and stuff like that. And it's because it would actually run, so that's what the prop houses would use. Oh, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that Pablo, who is the Falange old time officer, he can travel light on this mission, being a officer, and so he's carrying like grenades and some extra light machine gun ammunition, but he also carries a broom handle Mauser in its box holster on his hip, as well as a captured FN high power, which is 13 rounds of 9mm. This was, I think, it was the first war that the Browning high power was used in. That they got a lot of them through the the arms dealers to the Republic, and so I have him use a captured FN high power, which is feasible because you could get 9x19 ammo all day, every day.
Yeah, and those early pattern high powers are so neat with
They're
the
beautiful. Yeah.
yeah, they've got the the ridiculous sights that are graded up to like what 800 meters on them.
Yeah, because you could attach a stock to a lot of them and stuff. Yeah, they didn't all have the tangent sight, but I want to say almost most of them did. Depends on the contract.
Yeah, and Pablo is pretty well attached to the high power, I guess. Towards the end of the book, that the scene where him and Joseph, or I guess Joseph sends him another let's say like more high dollar or built up high power when he goes off to fight in the blue division.
Yeah, he nickel
Um,
plates it so that it'll hold up in the snow and stuff and not corrode as much. Yeah, because that's the technology that they had at the time. Yeah, so he sends them a nickel plated one with good sights.
yeah.
Because the
All
the
right.
Germans used high powers during the war also. So
Yeah, that my dream pistol is an SS marked high power. If I if I could get my hands on one of those, I'd be content.
I think Pete has one. I'm pretty
Yeah,
confident that he has one with the Waffenamts.
yeah, because the I think it was the SS in particular used the high power a lot because they didn't have access or regular access to
Correct.
like the standard German logistical train. That's why
They
like in
had
the invasion of Poland they had all this wacky stuff.
Yeah, they had a lot of Czech stuff, and yeah, they had all kinds of interesting stuff.
Yeah. All right. So back to with the Crusaders. So I guess that's sort of wrapping up the Spain sections that I wanted to talk about. But one more or one last major gun bit in the book is towards the end. We get back into the United States. Joseph has transitioned, I guess, from his British handlers to his new American handlers under Donovan, and he starts his new life that we see play out into the original faction novel. But he starts out and his new career with a fairly large purchase of military surplus firearms in New York. So can you kind of go into that?
Yeah, so the really important thing to understand about the way that the American intelligence and British intelligence worked at the time is they did out everything outside of official channels, and they did it in partnership with each other. So when the British were building up their like SOE, like the secret operations executive, special operations executive, excuse me, um, they were doing a lot of stuff in Canada, and the money was flowing through the United States, and then the weapons and equipment were being purchased in the United States and then taken up to Canada for these training centers. He goes to Camp X when it's like basically like staked out, and it's just like a fence. There's like almost nothing in there, but he goes up and he delivers his cargo of small arms that he's been tasked with, putting together. If you had, prove your ability to like scrimp and save, and like how would you equip a unit like in the most cost effective way. And so he goes to Hudson Sporting Goods, which was it was a real shop in New York City, right off the Hudson River. They had a warehouse across the river in New Jersey, and a huge warehouse, and it was basically all this World War I surplus stuff, like, or they would also do police surplus and police trade-ins. So just like we see now, like if a police department wants to swap to new gear, they'll go to a dealer and they'll basically get it. They'll save X% on their acquisition of, like, let's say, I want to get rid of all my SIG 320s because I don't want people blowing their dicks off. I want to get the Glock, Gen 5 or Gen 6 or whatever that's coming. So they get 20% off the deal, 20 to 30% off the deal, and then all those used pistols can be sold. Well, the same thing happened back in the day, and Hudson Sporting Goods was a big one for that. They were selling all this old World War I stuff. They had bought, I feel like all of the handguns that the British acquired that were in Canada, that was purchased in preparation for World War I, that ended up not being used, or it got surplused after the war. And so Hudson Sporting Goods flooded America with this stuff, and they would, like I said, they would do the cartridge conversions. There were other dealers that were doing this, but Hudson Sporting Goods was open at the time in New York City, and so I was like, let's have him go there because I'm a gun nerd. And so anyway, I had catalogs. I found catalogs online for Hudson Sporting Goods in this era, so I was able to accurately put together what you could purchase for X amount of dollars, and the idea being that Joseph is gearing all these weapons up, and he's going to have this package that can be disseminated at any time when Donovan tells him to, and Donovan kind of leads him to do this in this very independent fashion so that he can have a package that's ready here, and then he does another one later to Camp X. And the one he goes to on Vancouver Island in Victoria was a real camp also. So this is all stuff that was done in real life, and was completely feasible. So I was like, why not do it? Why not talk about that and tell a true story? The funny thing too is that, like, he couldn't get the handguns to him because of the Sullivan Law in New York at the time. But he can ship them to him on the other side of the country, because at the time, like, it's not like they were doing background checks and fingerprinting. That was up to the local localities, so they could just like ship a huge shipment of arms across the country, like in a totally uncontrolled fashion, other than doing the paperwork for the government, of course.
Yeah, things were certainly simpler back then.
Very different.
Yeah. Well, those are most of the points I wanted to hit on tonight. Are there anything major that we might be missing out on?
There's a fun scene in Seattle when he goes to it was a real gun shop at the time, and there's some wheeling and dealing, and part of it for me was just because I love the gun shop experience and the wheeling and dealing. And this is a real shop that was weird. It went out of business, and the people talked about are long dead, so like legally unprotected there for basically accusing them of basically alluding to things, not accusing them of anything. But they really want to get the the star stamped Mauser Bolo that's almost certainly a Red Army veteran, and things of that nature. Plus talk about the cool guns that you could get at the time. Like, what would you get if you were returning from war and you wanted to get like some real fighting weapons? You were pretty limited. Other than handguns, you had all kinds of wonderful stuff, but yeah, like the what is it, the Winchester 1907 that he gets. That's a semi-auto, mag-fed, pistol caliber. They had 5-round, 10-round, and 15-round magazines, but the 15-round magazines were not nearly as common as the 10-rounders. And he learns about the National Firearms Act of 1933. He was just totally unaware of it because he'd been out of the country, you know. And so, you know, a lot of it is just all in good fun. He gets a um, not a registered Magnum, but a one of the just like issue, like the one of the factory ones. This was like a really like hot shit gun store at the time. But the owners were sketchy and they ran a whorehouse upstairs in their building, and they were protected within the city government, probably just because of like straight up corruption. And Seattle was very corrupt at the time, so there's talk about that there. And you know, based Joe Shea just fuming as he's in there with his wife and just being like super mad. I just thought it was something that I could have fun with.
Yeah,
But the
that
food
was a
gun,
funny scene. I didn't know if that was a real shop or not, or if you were just poking fun at Seattle.
it was no, it's a real shop. The building's not there anymore. It got turned down, but they were pawnbrokers, and then they built a building that had the sporting goods store on the most of the ground floor, like half to 2/3 of the ground floor, and then above it was like it was sketchy. But certain ethno-sectarian types do that sort of stuff like crazy. So
Yeah.
even if they are almost unnoticeable to you in your youth when you frolic in their areas, and it was funny because they had really cool they had a collection of really cool guns that were in the display windows out front that were not for sale. And they were like they had all kinds of really rare pistols that they would just say it's not for sale, that they would just put on display. They had crazy stuff, like they had a boxed, like excuse me, a cased, you know, like beautiful hardwood velour lined like Luger carbine from the 30s, that they had some insane price on it that I'm sure they eventually sold, but it was there like my whole life until like the last time I was in the shop like 15-20 years ago. But they had like all kinds of really exotic stuff, and they were very like, if you tried to do a deal, like the nice guys that you liked talking to who ran the shop like would step back, and then the shysters would come in, and it would just be, you just were just like, no, I have more dignity than to do a deal with you.
Yeah.
So
All right. Well, I guess to sort of cap it off, Carl, what are your, we'll go with top 5 guns from With the Crusaders and why.
okay. I love the Winchester 1895 rifle and the the story behind the Russian contract weapons. It's just so absurd that like the Russian contract managers in the United States were like, the wood grain isn't beautiful enough, so we reject this one. So then Winchester would sell it on the American market. But it's a really interesting snapshot in time because they called it a musket because it was a very long barrel with wood running out to the end. It was the military profile, right? And so they had been trying to sell these things like in the United States and other countries. So the reason that they got the Russian contract was because they could manufacture them. They had the line ready to go. And during World War I, the Russians were desperate for weapons. There we go. It's just
That's
a
a
super
beautiful
cool
gun.
rifle. Super cool rifle. Their value has skyrocketed. You can find the ones that the Spanish, the Franco regime surplused out after the war that have like Spanish Republic arsenal markings on them and stuff, which is, I would love to get one of those. But I really do feel the need to get a modern one, um, because they're remade again. I think they're manufactured in Japan actually, by Moroku for Winchester, and then do a 7mm Mauser conversion into like a military configuration. I just think that would be awesome. I also love the El Tigre converted into the takedown, with the suppressor. So it's a short barrel. So it's like a 14-inch barrel basically, which was uh, there was a version of the takedown rifle that had that half magazine tube. So the mag tube goes out to the end of the forend, and then the barrel was just barely longer than it, with the attachment for the Maxim suppressor, and that's just an awesome. That would be perfect for that era. Like it'd be hard to beat. That's better than a Delisle silenced carbine in my opinion. Um, I love the I love the Fitz revolvers, of course. I love machine pistols. So of course the Broomy machine pistol, whichever one, it doesn't matter. Those are awesome. And then one that we didn't talk about, but is a good one, is his little Hungarian 32 automatic, that is his like deep cover weapon that he picks up, and carries it in Spain, in like in his boot. And I can't remember. I don't think that he really used. He has it in his hand a couple times, but it's just this microscopic little pistol, that is very cool, but not not the greatest design for. Yeah, there we go. It's the Frommer baby. So there's a Frommer stop you'll see there, which is the full size version of it. It's still a pretty small pistol, but if you look at the Frommer baby, you'll see it. It's teensy, but it's not something that you can really, that would cycle with a suppressor on it, because it has this really strange operating system. Um, Let me see. I can find a exploded view for you. They're just really interesting, but like finicky and weird.
It's got a non-detachable magazine if I'm not mistaken, right? Like the full
No,
size
it
Frommer.
it has a detachable magazine. It has a detachable magazine. Here's I found a picture of an exploded view. It has like a rotating bolt. It's like real ridiculous. The baby's the same. Here, I'm gonna put it into the chat. Here we go. So this is just one image of it. This is the full size, fully disassembled, um, and the baby is similar enough. It's just a teensy version of it.
Boy, howdy, that's a interesting system.
Yeah, so it's the same mechanism as a semi-auto rifle that they used, in their trials, and the barrel has like a chamber area that the bolt travels in, and the whole barrel chamber area reciprocates. Um, it actually is blow forward. So you see the rod above that has springs on both sides, and then you have like the spring that goes over it, that goes into that upper tube, in and everything. And so it's this really wacky design where it blows forward while the bolt goes back. And that's just too much mass for like and for a suppressor to really work. But it's cool. It's weird. And the baby is so small that it, when you see pictures of it in people's hands, it's just like, it's itty bitty. So it's cool. It's cool and weird.
Awesome. Well, Karl, what is the what is the future looking like for you? What are you working on?
I am, so like I said, I'll just do that Modern Liberator article for my Substack, but my big project that I'm working on right now is translating this Memorias de la Conspiración, which is like I said, the memoir of one of the leaders of the who developed the Carlist Recates, who did the financing, who did the arms requisitions, who did the leadership. He was captured in Madrid and was in one of these prisons where they ended up killing basically everybody. But he kind of played dumb, and he had the help of a childhood friend of his who had gone onto the communist side, who helped him get out of there, which is really interesting, and he's very lucky. But it's very interesting, and it's going to take me some time. I'm going through because OCR is only so fast, especially when you have like accents and a lot of the weird markup of Spanish and everything. So I am getting everything cleaned up and then doing the translation document. And then that way I'll have Spanish and English, and I could publish both. I could do a version with both English and Spanish. I could do separate versions, whatever I want to do. I'm working on getting the rights to it. At the very least, I'll have a translated version, and so I'll definitely be going through that with Pete on his show. Other than that, you can find me at karldahl.substack.com, Twitter, Caudio Dahl, and my two books, Faction and Faction with the Crusaders, are on Amazon, and hopefully I can add another historical document to my things for sale on Amazon as well, because I think it's really important stuff for us to understand given the era that we're in and going into.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again, Karl, for coming on. This is a great time. I love talking about guns any opportunity I can.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys. I appreciate it.
All right, and we'll be back next Wednesday.